The government changes in England that started in April 1258 were based on Henry III's actions since 1234. After his father died, his father's old colleagues mainly ran the government. In 1232, Hubert de Burgh was removed from his position in a palace coup. After that, Henry's nephew Peter de Rebellious tried to gain control over both the national and local government. New wars began in Wales and Ireland in 1233, and support was limited to his followers. Henry was urged to pay attention only to the advice of the local men in the country. A civil war started in 1233, and Henry lost his job in April 1234. Henry VIII's lack of political foresight was made worse by the weak state of the royal funds. After Roches was dismissed, the government mainly focused on paying down debt for 2 years. During this time they noticed a significant drop in money coming from county fields. Updating the exchequer's audit process worked fairly well, and the gains from the general heir helped the king pay off many of his bills. 2 costly royal weddings soon put Henry's finances in a bad position. In 1236, the council had to take a close look at all the money the crown was bringing in. After 1245, Henry VIII depended on unpopular ways to raise money to get taxes from Parliament. Many bishop positions were unfilled, and Jews had to pay a lot of money, which led to financial problems for their community and created anger among Christians. County judges were more interested in making money than serving justice, which led to more fines and bribes. Sheriffs struggled to manage their budgeting and government costs, which resulted in corruption and misuse of traditional hospitality. County knights took over the leadership from the gentry and openly criticized Henry VIII's poor governance. Parliament was important in expressing and organizing these complaints. Henry VIII's lenient treatment of his powerful nobles worked well for almost 13 years. However, the intense competition between groups at the royal court in the 1250s eventually weakened his success. The conflict started during the king's early years, when the English court still had many nobles from the Angevin kingdom. Peter de Roche, who was born in Touraine, influenced Henry's ideas about being a king. In 1247, Henry VIII brought the Lusignan family to England, children of his mother Isabella of Angouléme's second marriage to the Poitevin Count, Henry de Lusignan. The family received large lands in Wales and Ireland, and William de Valence married Joan de Montchenicy, who shared ownership of the Pembroke County. About 100 Poitevins joined them, but by 1251, only one stayed in Henry's service. The ongoing feud persisted as Henry's half-brothers took advantage of their close ties with the king. Feelings against the Lusignans grew stronger as they fought with other powerful nobles and court members, like Roger Bigod, the Earl of Norfolk, and John Fitzgeoffrey. Simon de Montfort became their strongest opponent, especially against William de Valence. Henry VIII wanted to strengthen his control over Gascony, an area that has often seen conflicts between Castile and Aragon. Montfort was put in charge to bring order and strengthen defenses, but his strict leadership and heavy spending caused chaos, leading to his removal in 1252. In 1253, Henry went to Bordeaux, but the trip left the kingdom's finances in bad shape. Henry noticed the Holy Roman Empire, especially the Kingdom of Sicily, which could help the Pope gain more control over their land. In April 1258, Henry VIII lost control of his rule because of different groups fighting for power, which had caused issues in his court since the late 1240s. Tensions increased after events in the Welsh valleys 2 years ago, when the English crown acknowledged Llywelyn ap Gruffydd and his brother Owain as the rulers of Snowdonia in North Wales. English laws, traditions, fees, and administration were forced on the Welsh, ignoring their feelings. This caused a lot of anger and protests about how tough English rule was. In 1254, there was hope for the Welsh people when they learned that Henry had given Edward all of the crown's lands in Wales as part of his marriage dowry. However, things did not get better because Edward's own officials were even harsher. The war between the Welsh and Marchers in 1257 led Edward to hire key Marcher lords and peers, such as John de Warenne and Henry of Almaine. Eleanor and her Savoyard friends were worried about losing their power and the prince asking for more freedom. Edward's money issues got worse because the war in Wales was using up his funds, but the Lusignans were ready to help him financially. The revolution started because of an argument in Shire, Surrey, where John Fitzgeoffrey, the owner of the land, was in a conflict with Netley Abbey. A new parliament met at Westminster to discuss Henry's request for a new tax. However, Henry's biased reactions stirred up a lot of anger and strengthened the belief that he was protected and couldn't be prosecuted. On April 30th, 1258, the 7 nobles left for Westminster, fully armored, and respectfully greeted Henry as their king. Norfolk gave the rest of the ultimatum. Henry and Edward must promise to follow the advice of his noble advisors and agree to improve the condition of the kingdom. The terms of the deal were released on May 2nd, saying that changes would be made to the kingdom by Christmas of 1258, based on the advice from the 24. In 1258, the Oxford Parliament started during a time of conflict between the Lusignan family and others. The powerful leaders and high-ranking church officials were followed by their large groups of supporters, showing their importance and influence. This diverse environment was important for changing what started as a royal takeover into a popular movement that focused on political and administrative change. Many members of the gentry class were unhappy with Henry's leadership because the king's efforts to please the powerful nobles led to more pressure on the knights and smaller farms. The elite wanted a complete change in the court system and had a strong dislike for the Lusignans. The barons' petition included 29 complaints that called for changes in the king's rules or updates to certain laws. The Provisions of Oxford, created during the June Parliament, were among the first changes aimed at changing the central government. So, Hugh Bigod was reinstated as the chief judge. He would oversee all 3 ministers by requiring them to take oaths of office, submit yearly reports, and serve for only 1 year at a time. In the shires, local government was exposed to a similar process of root and branch change. The Lusignans, who were half-brothers of the reformers, were against bringing back the judiciary and taking back royal castles and lands. They thought this was a planned move to weaken their power. The Provisions of Oxford marked a significant step forward for reform in the royal prerogative, placing the crown in commission and restructuring central government and local administration. However, there was still much that needed reformation, such as little attention given to the church's grievances or urban governance. The councillors had to move on from the excitement of Oxford and focus on implementation. London, the country's commercial and political capital, was expected to support the reformist cause due to corruption scandals and Henry's new gold coinage. The council presented the provisions to the city's citizens, who took an oath to save their liberties and customs. Henry accepted the new baronial council and his personal oath to comply with its decisions. International affairs were also a priority for the council, with a truce agreed with Llywelyn's envoys and a diplomatic conference at Montgomery. The council displayed little enthusiasm for the Mediterranean enterprise and insisted on 2 concessions from the papacy: mitigation of its demands and the appointment of a legate. Pope Alexander IV formally revoked the kingdom's grant to Edmund, and other suitable candidates for the throne would now be considered. In the late summer of 1258, the council focused on domestic matters, preparing for administrative and legal reform. Meetings were held daily in London, discussing the reform of the realm's usages and customs. The council issued the Ordinance of the Sheriffs, aiming to manipulate public opinion and publicize measures taken to remedy a long-standing grievance. The Michaelmas Parliament on October 13, 1259, was an important part of the baronial council's efforts to change Henry's government. New rules were created for royal officials, and the council made decisions about national policy. There is a conflict among the lord leaders about how fast and how much to change things, which is frustrating the gentry. Reformers, led by Montfort, pushed for strict rules for all local governments. In contrast, traditional leaders, led by Gloucester, saw this as a threat to their own interests. The divide between the two noble levels had caused tension between them, and some liberals thought about going back to the old way of having a monarchy. On October 13th, there was a heated protest by the bachelors of England outside the new Parliament. They were upset because they believed the upcoming laws would ignore the needs of smaller landowners and only benefit a few wealthy people. Edward quickly took action, promising to help others, even though it put his life at risk. The Provisions of Westminster, announced on October 24th, intended to forever change the law and its processes. They addressed the challenging relationship between landlords and renters and offered more safety for tenants' rights to receive. The rules also dealt with complaints about the criminal justice system and created new investigations. This included a group to look into changing the treasury system, lowering the crown's debt, and figuring out the Queen's gold payment. In 1259, the Council of England ratified a peace treaty with France, but in 1260, the Council's mainstays were abandoned and the Council ceased to function. The issue of Eleanor de Montfort's dower remained outstanding, and Montfort circumvented the award with help from his conciliar allies. The baronial councillors swore to uphold the revised version, and the treaty was published in December. Henry VIII, offended by Montfort's departure, decided to remain in France for the marriage of his eldest daughter Beatrice to the future Duke of Brittany. He formed an inner cabal to instigate discord within the baronial ranks and create a rift between them and the militant supporters of Montfort and Lord Edward. Henry VIII's 3-week hiatus in France was used to his advantage, as he blamed the council for his delay and refused to hold any commissions in his realm. Edward, who had backed Montfort, exploited the weakness of the rump council left behind in England after his parents' departure for France. He made an overture to his father in a spirit of reconciliation, but was met with a guarded response from the king. Conflict seemed increasingly likely as both sides began arming themselves. Montfort, a key figure in the reform movement, failed to hold another parliament in London, causing significant political repercussions. The presence of armed men from Montfort and Edward's retinues in London alarmed its citizens, and the arrival of Gloucester further exacerbated these fears. Richard of Cornwall, a mediator, persuaded the civic authorities to exclude all magnates and their retinues from the capital, resulting in a standoff between Henry VIII and his eldest son, Edward. Edward publicly denied plotting against his father and submitted to royal arbitration. Henry VIII accepted his proposed impeachment with equanimity, insisting on the exclusion of 5 unspecified enemies from the panel of judges. Gloucester, fearing an investigation could reveal his intrigues, successfully persuaded Henry to delay proceedings until the forthcoming Parliament in July. An episcopal committee was constituted to investigate Montfort's charges, which focused on his obstruction of the French peace, acquisition of certain royal domain manors, and obdurate defiance. The trial of Montfort was postponed due to the unexpected news of Builth's fall after a 6-month siege. The council's decision-making process was influenced by conflicting opinions, and the council's plans for a campaign were postponed until the Michaelmas Parliament in October. Montfort conceived an alliance with the Earl of Gloucester to re-enter public life, but the council ceased to function within 2 months. In 1260, Henry VIII took back control of the government and used disagreements among council members to his advantage. They had to choose between following him or supporting the reform movement. His brother-in-law Montfort upset the reasonable members of the council, which caused the council to be changed, but the provisions still stayed in place. So, he decided to be more deceitful, pretending to support the provisions in public while privately working to get rid of them. Montfort's departure in France made things easier for Henry, likely because his wife claimed her family rights in Angoulême. She started a legal process against the Lusignans and chose 3 experts to settle any issues. Henry was open to arbitration because settling Montfort's claims might have reduced his interest in change. Henry VIII took back control of the chancery, which let him give commands and orders by himself. He approved steps to increase military preparation for possible conflict. In 1258, he got ready to officially remove the provisions by appointing Robert Wallerend as the caretaker of Marlborough and Ludgate Hall castles. Edward de Lusignan's sudden death in December deeply upset Henry, and he came back with his uncle, William de Valence. Edward chose to leave because he was low on money. He had strong connections with his uncles from Lusignan and Montfort, who had urged him to be independent before 1258. Henry VIII's announcement in Winchester in 1261 ended more than 18 months of planning. It addressed the council's inability to keep its promises and the loss of royal power. Henry had been secretly preparing to get rid of the provisions by gathering money and training soldiers to hire foreign fighters. Pope Alexander IV freed Henry and his followers from their promises to the provisions. For the king, getting this freedom was worth any trouble it caused. In July 1258, Henry VIII and Montfort reached a deal with Hugh IV, Duke of Burgundy, and Peter le Chamberlain from France. Negotiations stopped, and Montfort and Gloucester took on shared leadership of the new group, which included both strong reformers and more moderate members, as well as local landowners. The Winchester coup brought out the anger of the local gentry and landowners, resulting in protests in Worcester and the halt of the Hertfordshire court. Henry VIII decided to replace all sheriffs with people from the nobility and government leaders. This was an important move to strengthen the crown's power over local government. In early September, tensions increased when Montfort, Gloucester and Walter de Cantilupe called for 3 knights from each county to meet them at St. Albans. This was a challenge to Henry's claim to be the unquestioned master. The Treaty of Kingston ended Henry VIII's attempts to strengthen the power of the crown. The king and his wife convinced the Baron reformers to agree on a solution. They suggested using arbitration to settle disagreements about the provisions and the kingdom's issues. The town faced little open resistance, with only a small group of nobles staying stubborn. Simon de Montfort, a strong supporter of change, openly rejected the conditions set in Kingston. Henry took control of the country and its government, and the general air was restored 6 months after it was stopped. The local community was worried about the unchecked actions of the powerful officials who were struggling because of the selfish interests of the barons. Henry's way of dealing with the baronial guards rounded out his attempts to please the locals. In 1258, Henry VIII formally buried the provisions, confirming the Pope bulls of forgiveness from the oath to the provisions. The royal family was not very connected to the rest of the political world, with only 2 local nobles attending regularly. Henry VIII, sure of his power as a king, went to France to deal with problems from the Treaty of Paris and to weaken his brother-in-law's influence at the French court. He took Queen Margaret's offer to help resolve the ongoing dispute about Eleanor de Montfort's inheritance, seeing it as a great chance to publicly undermine Montfort. 2 events changed English politics and weakened Henry's rule. The Earl of Gloucester died, and Gilbert de Clare's death changed the political landscape. Henry started looking into claims that Gloucester was wrongly taking royal rights. A deadly disease hit the English court, and Henry became very sick, leaving money to his wife Eleanor. Montfort came to London with a letter from Pope Urban IV that fully supported the provisions. The Welsh storm wiped out the last signs of Henry's power, resulting in the damage and takeover of Upper Gwent. In 1263, Henry VIII found himself in a tough position in Herefordshire because Welsh troops had damaged the area and Llywelyn was in charge of Wales. The Marchers were only willing to protect their own lands, which caused dissatisfaction with Henry's leadership. Henry's efforts to gain public backing didn't work as unrest continued throughout the kingdom. Simon de Montfort, an important leader in the reform movement, came back to England in 1263 and headed a group focused on restoring the provisions. The first meeting of this group happened in Oxford, where members broke their oaths and asked the king to make sure the provisions were followed. Henry, a strong backer of the reform movement, refused the demands from the barons. He believed that his armed power would intimidate his enemies and stop them from trying to bring back the provisions by force. The ires started in April, and because the crown felt sure of its power, they planned 2 new ires for Suffolk and Yorkshire in May. However, there wasn't much consideration for the concerns of the nobles, as gifts, jobs, and benefits continued to be given to chosen allies. The chaotic situation in Wales caused a delay in Henry's offer to Llywelyn. At the same time, Edward I and a group of rebels tried to take down the throne in Wales. Edward's failure in Wales made people believe that the royal family preferred foreigners over local citizens, and the crown's reliance on foreign soldiers revealed its flaws. Henry VIII focused on keeping his communication routes open to France and the rest of Europe. He wanted to control access to the land to get more military support. He also improved military bases, weapons, and supplies to deal with the military threat to Henry's rule. The revolt quickly grew, with the rebels directing their anger mainly at important royal supporters. Richard of Cornwall suggested talks with the lords, and bishops encouraged Henry and Edward to agree to the peace plan offered by the bishops of London, Lincoln, Coventry, and Lichfield. Edward's bold adventure opened Pandora's box in London, causing a violent uprising and a change in power in the city. Simon de Montfort, who took control of England without official approval, managed to remove the royal government in under 3 months and wanted to rearrange the government to fit his own plans. On July 16, 1263, he announced a peace agreement that confirmed the rules made in 1258 at the Oxford Parliament. It stated that only native-born men who were loyal and helpful to the king would be in charge of the government. The request for foreigners to leave the country showed that the baronial movement was taking a more popular approach. Montfort's government leveraged this public support, maintaining a significant political influence until 1265 and beyond. The new leaders had important problems to deal with, like changing the royal family, paying off bills to important supporters, and bringing back law and order in the counties. The effects of the war were still felt in the countryside, causing economic problems for people thought to be foreigners or supporters of the royalists. The council's image was at risk because taking money for their losses made people feel unfairly treated, which could harm the newly restored government. Aliases were created involving the church in London, with bishops Walter de Cantilupe, Richard Gravesend, Henry of Sandwich, and Stephen Burstead running Montfort's government. The Council of 15 was divided, with only 4 members still strongly supporting the barons. Montfort's government dealt with many problems, such as uprisings, unrest in the counties, and a growing royalist movement. The return of the provisions was mostly talk, with very few real actions taken. It was a good time for royalists to regain power, and Montfort tried to establish a final agreement in London. Anger about the failed reparations plan took over the October meeting in Parliament at Westminster, causing Henry to demand the authority to choose his own household officials. In the summer of 1261, the Marchers, which included Richard of Cornwall and Henry of Amiens, changed their loyalties. Montfort chose to go through arbitration, thinking that a good decision in France would help improve the struggling government. Queen Eleanor and Queen Margaret backed the royalists, and their efforts were successful. Before going to France, Henry VIII tried one last time to increase his influence in the countryside by confirming his commitment to the provisions and his promise. The Treaty of Amiens was an important success for King Henry VIII, canceling the provisions and letting him choose his own officials. Louis did not officially promise to give Henry any extra help other than what the Treaty of Paris already required. The Montfortians claimed that the provisions were an obvious next step from Magna Carta, but Louis made sure to point out the differences between the two. News about the Mise spread fast, and some writers said that Louis had overstepped his authority during the trial. In London, the people who refused the Mise strengthened the city. Montfort, who had not fought back against Roger Mortimer's earlier attacks, decided to start fighting again. Wigmore Castle was the first castle to be taken, and Worcester was looted on February 28. Edward, back from France, caught Henry de Montfort in Worcester, but he missed the opportunity because he was too trusting. Northampton's fall was a short setback for the Royalists, but the king would soon gain the edge. Henry VIII made plans for how to respond to the fighting in Dover, where he was not allowed to enter. He chose to break Montfort's strong control in the Midlands and sent an army to Oxford. Montfort started talks with the king, agreeing to accept the Mise of Amiens completely, but wanted the king to agree that locals would be in charge of governance. Henry finished getting ready for the Civil War by sending a group of soldiers to take control of the houses at Reigate and Rochester. Simon de Montfort, a 13th century leader, won the Mise of Lewes, a temporary agreement that limited King Henry's power. He gained two agreements, one to review rule changes and another to resolve issues from the Mise of Amiens. Montfort took control of the royal office but faced armed danger and potential war. In 1264, he received money owed to Henry from the Treaty of Paris, but Queen Elizabeth claimed control. Montfort proposed a new constitution, which gained approval from the largest group of people. However, the Marchers refused to cooperate, leading Montfort and Clare to reclaim towns in the Welsh Marches. Montfort sought a peaceful resolution to the conflict, but a better plan was offered, including a commission in England to address conflicts and change the government. Simon de Montfort's efforts at diplomacy in 1264 were not fully successful because the talks did not result in a peace agreement that everyone, including the French court and the Pope representative, found acceptable. The Pope bulls of censure and ban were officially ended in a formal event, but their actual impact was small. This created divides among the barons as they often made compromises to satisfy both Louis and Fouquet during negotiations. Bishops found themselves in difficult situations, with many feeling uneasy about supporting changes that went against the Pope's wishes. Montfort's opinion about native-born Englishmen was the most important among the barons. The Marchers, who had once taken over royal forts, also joined in, leading to a new attack and the Peace of Worcester, which was signed with strict terms. The Peace of Worcester was an important time during King Henry VIII's rule, when Montfort had a lot of power. He quashed the Marcher threat and supported conciliar government ideals, leading to the opening of several royalist fortresses. Montfort's government respected the provisions and listened to the worries of county lords. He called for a meeting in London to support Montfort, which resulted in a brief time of peace in the countryside. Montfort's push for the provisions was weakened by his consistent use of his power to help his family's interests. He looked into complaints about his wife Eleanor's dowry and took charge of the Chester realm based on the Peace of Worcester agreement. This wealth changed Montfort's status among his peers and allowed him to build an armed group that was even larger than the king's. Montfort's family's excessive pride caused conflicts among the Montfortian leaders, leading to a serious problem during the Hilary Parliament in 1265. In 1265, Edward escaped from his guards in Hereford, starting a royalist attack against the Montfortians. In just 9 weeks, Simon de Montfort's rule would be taken away and the Earl killed. The Marchers were the main part of his new army, supported by the troops from Valence, Warenne, Robert Wallerand, Warren de Bassingbourn, and the old soldiers from Bristol. Montfort wanted to guide his strengthened army safely over the Severn River, but the capture of Gloucester on June 29 disrupted this plan. His son, Simon the Younger, failed to reach his father Edward's escape, causing a disastrous delay in his trip to Pevensey. Simon traveled north to London to gather men for the upcoming battle, but there were rumors about the loyalty of the city's people. On August 1st, Edward led a bold attack, dividing his army into 2 parts and taking the Kenilworth Road. The mission was a big success, capturing many important people. On August 3rd, Montfort's army and the captured king left Kempsey to avoid royalist spies and head to Evesham. Montfort's army heard about the plan and quietly marched through the night. They chose 12 soldiers to find Montfort on the battlefield and kill him. The Royalists kept killing, including Henry de Montfort, Despenser, William of Birmingham, and King Henry. Edward's men were extremely harsh and effective in reaching their goal, which Robert of Gloucester described simply as the murder of Evesham, because it was not a battle. In 1266, the royal supporters won a major battle at Evesham, which led to the death of Montfort, the leader of the Barons' Rebellion. This win gave Henry back his political power and let him choose his own ministers. The remaining rebels were not strong in their beliefs, and many soldiers gave up. After Evesham, there were only two places left that were still fighting back: the southeast region and the walls of Dover. Henry allowed the royalists to take over properties owned by rebels, resulting in a lot of looting and seizure of land. The most successful seizure happened in Devon, where more than 1,000 homes were taken. The royal government had serious problems, with confiscations happening all over the land. In 1266, Henry VIII wanted to strengthen royal power in London, as it was important for England's economy to recover. People in London strongly disliked him, which led to talks with the mayor and the creation of safe passages. Most people in London decided to follow along, and Henry started taking and getting rid of the property of important citizens. In October, Queen Eleanor arrived in Dover, and her son Edmund received Montfort's title and lands. The royalists attacked the Cinque Ports, but when Chelsea stood strong while they got ready for a siege. In 1267, the royalist efforts against Kenilworth stopped because of renewed trouble in other areas, mostly caused by the policy of disinheritance. The royalists had a big win at Chesterfield, but the siege of Kenilworth was very tough. The king's engineers, who built assault machines and defense barriers, were very important during the attack. Henry VIII's entry started the siege, but the fighting went on during the summer and fall. The harm caused by the disinheritance policy was acknowledged, and Ottobuono, a strong supporter of making peace, set up the dictum of Kenilworth. This allowed those who had lost their lands to get them back. The fighting went on, and the royalist soldiers gave up on December 16th. This was the longest battle in English history. As peace seemed close, the people who had been left out started using rebel tactics, which resulted in the attack on Norwich on December 16th. Henry tried to stop the war quietly, but talks fell apart when the rebels insisted on getting their lands back without any penalties and wanted the rules to be followed. After 10 years of political turmoil and conflict, peace was publicly achieved in England in 1267. The country was badly affected by the bloodshed and damage, but this brought about a new sense of hope. In 1267, a sense of balance and reason appeared, bringing peace to the land. The Treaty of Montgomery acknowledged Llywelyn as the Prince of Wales, and allowed the Welsh to control certain regions. The heir to terras datus was important for fixing problems in the local community and bringing back royal power. Henry VIII realized how important it was to make peace and explain his actions based on what happened from 1258 to 1267. The Statute of Marlborough updated the Provisions of Westminster, mainly by limiting the powers of the sheriff's torn and ending fines for unexpected deaths. Henry wanted to find a shared understanding for a special tax that could be properly collected without needing approval. Edward the Great, the King of England, became the most powerful leader in English politics by prioritizing peace and safety. The king and his child started to argue because of their different ages and personalities. Edward the Great learned from the years 1258 to 1267 and changed the court to be less about small groups competing for power and more open to others. He gave faithful service and support from the royal family to more people, including former Montfort supporters, and paid attention to the rules of the Magna Carta. England's legal system changed, and Parliament became known for handling tax issues and addressing complaints from many different groups of people. After peace was declared in 1267, the king aimed to learn from previous mistakes and improve policies, focusing on bringing people together and calming tensions in the counties. Consensus was the main principle, with local officials taking on a growing part in government work. Reform slowed down in the early 1290s because Edward had to focus entirely on foreign issues. Weaknesses in local government in the 1270s led to new measures that helped in the short term but weakened central control and strengthened the groups Edward wanted to limit. Edward II's rule was filled with political problems and renewed issues from the time of his predecessor, Henry VIII. His opponents, made up of important people from both the government and the church, tried to implement changes called the ordinances to improve the royal administration. However, these changes did not work and created ongoing political conflicts. During the difficult times of Charles I's rule, a movement against him started, influenced by political writings from judges like Edward Coke. Charles's most vocal critics were the Shire's chosen government members, who challenged the king's claim that he held an absolute discretionary power. In 1649, Charles was found guilty and hanged on a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. In the 1800s, scholars became more interested in the events from 1258 to 1267, viewing Simon de Montfort as a leader who helped start democratic government. People have worried about a lack of democracy in the European Union, and how public officials should behave became a hot topic in politics in the early 1990s.